This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 13. The House on the Hill. There was a little unfailing spring, always icy cold and crystal pure, in a certain birch-screened hollow of Rainbow Valley, in the lower corner near the marsh. Not a great many people knew of its existence. The manse and Ingleside children knew, of course, as they knew everything else about the Magic Valley. Occasionally they went there to get a drink, and it figured in many of their plays as a fountain of old romance. Anne knew of it and loved it because it somehow reminded her of the beloved Dryad's Bubble at Green Gables. Rosemary West knew of it. It was her fountain of romance, too. 18 years ago she had sat beside it one spring twilight and heard Martin Crawford stammer out a confession of fervent, boyish love. She had whispered her own secret in return, and they had kissed and promised by the wild wood spring. They had never stood together by it again. Martin had sailed on his fatal voyage soon after. But to Rosemary West it was always a sacred spot, hallowed by that immortal hour of youth and love. Whenever she passed near it, she turned aside to hold a secret tryst with an old dream, a dream from which the pain had long gone, leaving only its unforgettable sweetness. The spring was a hidden thing. You might have passed within 10 feet of it and never have suspected its existence. 2 generations past, a huge old pine had fallen almost across it. Nothing was left of the tree but its crumbling trunk, out of which the ferns grew thickly, making a green roof and a lacy screen for the water. A maple tree grew beside it, with a curiously gnarled and twisted trunk, creeping along the ground for a little way before shooting up into the air and so forming a quaint seat. And September had flung a scarf of pale smoke-blue asters around the hollow. John Meredith, taking the Cross Lots Road through Rainbow Valley on his way home from some pastoral visitations around the harbour head one evening, turned aside to drink of the little spring. Walter Blythe had shown it to him one afternoon, only a few days before, and they had had a long talk together on the maple seat. John Meredith, under all his shyness and aloofness, had the heart of a boy. He had been called Jack in his youth, though nobody in Glen St. Mary would ever have believed it. Walter and he had taken to each other, and had talked unreservedly. Mr. Meredith found his way into some sealed and sacred chambers of the lad's soul, wherein not even Di had ever looked. They were to be chums from that friendly hour, and Walter knew that he would never be frightened of the minister again. "I never believed before that it was possible to get really acquainted with a minister," he told his mother that night. John Meredith drank from his slender white hand, whose grip of steel always surprised people who were unacquainted with it, and then sat down on the maple seat. He was in no hurry to go home. This was a beautiful spot, and he was mentally weary, after a round of rather uninspiring conversations with many good and stupid people. The moon was rising. Rainbow Valley was wind-haunted and star-sentinelled only where he was, but afar from the upper end came the gay notes of children's laughter and voices. The ethereal beauty of the asters in the moonlight, the glimmer of the little spring, the soft croon of the brook, the wavering grace of the brackens, all wove a white magic round John Meredith. He forgot congregational worries and spiritual problems. The years slipped away from him. He was a young divinity student again, and the roses of June were blooming red and fragrant on the dark, queenly head of his Cecilia. He sat there and dreamed like any boy. And it was at this propitious moment that Rosemary West stepped aside from the bypath and stood beside him in that dangerous, spell-weaving place. John Meredith stood up as she came in, and saw her, really saw her, for the first time. He had met her in his church once or twice, and shaken hands with her abstractedly, as he did with anyone he happened to encounter on his way down the aisle. He had never met her elsewhere, for the Wests were Episcopalians, with church affinities in Lowbridge, and no occasion for calling upon them had ever arisen. Before tonight, if anyone had asked John Meredith what Rosemary West looked like, he would not have had the slightest notion, but he was never to forget her, as she appeared to him in the glamour of kind moonlight by the spring. She was certainly not in the least like Cecilia, who had always been his ideal of womanly beauty. Cecilia had been small and dark and vivacious. Rosemary West was tall and fair and placid. Yet John Meredith thought he had never seen so beautiful a woman. She was bare-headed, and her golden hair of a warm gold, molasses taffy colour, as Di Blythe had said, was pinned in sleek, close curls over her head. She had large, tranquil blue eyes that always seemed full of friendliness, a high white forehead, and a finely shaped face. Rosemary West was always called a sweet woman. She was so sweet that even her high-bred, stately air had never gained for her the reputation of being stuck up, which it would inevitably have done in the case of anyone else in Glen St. Mary. Life had taught her to be brave, to be patient, to love, to forgive. She had watched the ship on which her lover went sailing out of Four Winds Harbour into the sunset, but though she watched long, she had never seen it coming sailing back. That vigil had taken girlhood from her eyes, yet she kept her youth to a marvellous degree. Perhaps this was because she always seemed to preserve that attitude of delighted surprise towards life which most of us leave behind in childhood, an attitude which not only made Rosemary herself seem young, but flung a pleasing illusion of youth over the consciousness of everyone who talked to her. John Meredith was startled by her loveliness, and Rosemary was startled by his presence. She had never thought she would find anyone by that remote spring, least of all the recluse of Glen St. Mary Manse. She almost dropped the heavy armful of books she was carrying home from the Glen Lending Library, and then, to cover her confusion, she told one of those small fibs which even the best of women do tell at times. I came for a drink," she said, stammering a little, in answer to Mr. Meredith's grave, "Good evening, Miss West." She felt that she was an unpardonable goose, and she longed to shake herself. But John Meredith was not a vain man, and he knew she would likely have been as much startled had she met old Elder Clow in that unexpected fashion. Her confusion put him at ease, and he forgot to be shy. Besides, even the shyest of men can sometimes be quite audacious in moonlight. "Let me get you a cup," he said, smiling. There was a cup nearby, if he had only known it, a cracked, handleless blue cup, secreted under the maple by the Rainbow Valley children. But he did not know it, so he stepped out to one of the birch trees and stripped a bit of its white skin away. Deftly he fashioned this into a three-cornered cup, filled it from the spring, and handed it to Rosemary. Rosemary took it and drank every drop to punish herself for her fib, for she was not in the least thirsty, and to drink a fairly large cupful of water when you are not thirsty is somewhat of an ordeal. Yet the memory of that draught was to be very pleasant to Rosemary. In after years it seemed to her that there was something sacramental about it. Perhaps this was because of what the minister did when she handed him back the cup. He stooped again and filled it, and drank of it himself. It was only by accident that he put his lips just where Rosemary had put hers, and Rosemary knew it. Nevertheless, it had a curious significance for her. They too had drunk of the same cup. She remembered idly that an old aunt of hers used to say that when two people did this, their afterlives would be linked in some fashion, whether for good or ill. John Meredith held the cup uncertainly. He did not know what to do with it. The logical thing would have been to toss it away, but somehow he was disinclined to do this. Rosemary held out her hand for it. "Will you let me have it?" she said. "You made it so knackily. I never saw anyone make a birch cup so since my little brother used to make them long ago, before he died. I learned how to make them when I was a boy, camping out one summer. An old hunter taught me," said Mr. Meredith. "Let me carry your books, Miss West." Rosemary was startled into another fib, and said oh, they were not heavy. But the minister took them from her with quite a masterful air, and they walked away together. It was the first time Rosemary had stood by the valley spring without thinking of Martin Crawford. The mystic tryst had been broken. The little bypath wound around the marsh, and then struck up the long wooded hill on the top of which Rosemary lived. Beyond, through the trees, they could see the moonlight shining across the level summer fields, but the little path was shadowy and narrow. Trees crowded over it, and trees are never quite as friendly to human beings after nightfall as they are in daylight. They wrap themselves away from us. They whisper and plot furtively. If they reach out a hand to us, it has a hostile, tentative touch. People walking amid trees after night always draw closer together, instinctively and involuntarily, making an alliance, physical and mental, against certain alien powers around them. Rosemary's dress brushed against John Meredith as they walked. Not even an absent-minded minister, who was after all a young man still, though he firmly believed he had outlived romance, could be insensible to the charm of the night, and the path, and the companion. It is never quite safe to think we have done with life. When we imagine we have finished our story, fate has a trick of turning the page and showing us yet another chapter. These two people each thought their hearts belonged irrevocably to the past, but they both found their walk up that hill very pleasant. Rosemary thought the Glen minister was by no means as shy and tongue-tied as he had been represented. He seemed to find no difficulty in talking easily and freely. Glen housewives would have been amazed had they heard him. But then so many Glen housewives talked only gossip and the price of eggs, and John Meredith was not interested in either. He talked to Rosemary of books and music and wide-world doings, and something of his own history, and found that she could understand and respond. Rosemary, it appeared, possessed a book which Mr. Meredith had not read and wished to read. She offered to lend it to him, and when they reached the old homestead on the hill, he went in to get it. The house itself was an old-fashioned grey one, hung with vines, through which the light in the sitting-room winked in friendly fashion. It looked down the glen, over the harbour, silvered in the moonlight, to the sand dunes and the moaning ocean. They walked in through a garden that always seemed to smell of roses, even when no roses were in bloom. There was a sisterhood of lilies at the gate, and a ribbon of asters on either side of the broad walk, and a lacery of fir trees on the hill's edge beyond the house. "You have the whole world at your doorstep here," said John Meredith with a long breath. "What a view! What an outlook! At times I feel stifled down there in the glen. You can breathe up here." "It is calm tonight," said Rosemary, laughing. "If there were a wind, it would blow your breath away. We get all the arts the wind can blow up here. This place should be called Four Winds instead of the harbour." "I like wind," he said. "A day when there is no wind seems to me dead. A windy day wakes me up." He gave a conscious laugh. "On a calm day I fall into daydreams. No doubt you know my reputation, Miss West. If I cut you dead the next time we meet, don't put it down to bad manners. Please understand that it is only abstraction, and forgive me, and speak to me." They found Ellen West in the sitting-room when they went in. She laid her glasses down on the book she had been reading, and looked at them in amazement, tinctured with something else. But she shook hands amiably with Mr. Meredith, and he sat down and talked to her, while Rosemary hunted out his book. Ellen West was 10 years older than Rosemary, and so different from her that it was hard to believe they were sisters. She was dark and massive, with black hair, thick black eyebrows, and eyes of the clear slaty blue of the Gulf water in a north wind. She had a rather stern, forbidding look, but she was in reality very jolly, with a hearty gurgling laugh, and a deep, mellow, pleasant voice, with a suggestion of masculinity about it. She had once remarked to Rosemary that she would really like to have a talk with that Presbyterian minister at the Glen, to see if he could find a word to say to a woman when he was cornered. She had her chance now, and she tackled him on world politics. Miss Ellen, who was a great reader, had been devouring a book on the Kaiser of Germany, and she demanded Mr. Meredith's opinion of him. "A dangerous man," was his answer. "I believe you," Miss Ellen nodded. "Mark my words, Mr. Meredith, that man is going to fight somebody yet. He's aching to. He is going to set the world on fire." "If you mean that he will wantonly precipitate a great war, I hardly think so," said Mr. Meredith. "The day has gone by for that sort of thing." "Bless you, it hasn't," rumbled Ellen. "The day never goes by for men and nations to make asses of themselves and to take to the fists. The millennium isn't that near, Mr. Meredith, and you don't think it is any more than I do. As for this Kaiser, mark my words, he is going to make a heap of trouble." And Miss Ellen prodded her book emphatically with her long finger. "Yes, if he isn't nipped in the bud, he's going to make trouble. We'll live to see it. You and I will live to see it, Mr. Meredith. And who is going to nip him? England should, but she won't. Who is going to nip him? Tell me that, Mr. Meredith." Mr. Meredith couldn't tell her, but they plunged into a discussion of German militarism that lasted long after Rosemary had found the book. Rosemary said nothing, but sat in a little rocker behind Ellen and stroked an important black cat meditatively. John Meredith hunted big game in Europe with Ellen, but he looked oftener at Rosemary than at Ellen, and Ellen noticed it. After Rosemary had gone to the door with him and come back, Ellen rose and looked at her accusingly. "Rosemary West, that man has a notion of courting you." Rosemary quivered. Ellen's speech was like a blow to her. It rubbed all the bloom off the pleasant evening, but she would not let Ellen see how it hurt her. "Nonsense," she said, and laughed, a little too carelessly. "You see a beau for me in every bush, Ellen. Why, he told me all about his wife tonight, how much she was to him, how empty her death had left the world." "Well, that may be his way of courting," retorted Ellen. "Men have all kinds of ways, I understand, but don't forget your promise, Rosemary." "There is no need of my either forgetting or remembering it," said Rosemary, a little wearily. "You forget that I'm an old maid, Ellen. It is only your sisterly delusion that I am still young and blooming and dangerous. Mr. Meredith merely wants to be a friend, if he wants that much itself. He'll forget us both long before he gets back to the manse." "I've no objection to your being friends with him," conceded Ellen, "but it mustn't go beyond friendship, remember. I'm always suspicious of widowers. They are not given to romantic ideas about friendship. They're apt to mean business. As for this Presbyterian man, what do they call him shy for? He's not a bit shy, though he may be absent-minded. So absent-minded that he forgot to say good night to me when you started to go to the door with him. He's got brains, too. There's so few men round here that can talk sense to a body. I've enjoyed the evening. I wouldn't mind seeing more of him." But no philandering, Rosemary. Mind you, no philandering." Rosemary was quite used to being warned by Ellen from philandering if she so much as talked 5 minutes to any marriageable man under 80 or over 18. She had always laughed at the warning with unfeigned amusement. This time it did not amuse her. It irritated her a little. Who wanted to philander? "Don't be such a goose, Ellen," she said with unaccustomed shortness, as she took her lamp. She went upstairs without saying good night. Ellen shook her head dubiously and looked at the black cat. "What is she so cross about, St. George?" she asked. "When you howl you're hit, I've always heard, George. But she promised, Saint. She promised, and we Wests always keep our word. So it won't matter if he does want to philander, George. She promised. I won't worry." Upstairs in her room, Rosemary sat for a long while, looking out of the window across the moonlit garden to the distant, shining harbour. She felt vaguely upset and unsettled. She was suddenly tired of outworn dreams, and in the garden the petals of the last red rose were scattered by a sudden little wind. Summer was over. It was autumn. End of chapter 13. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Reading by Robin Cotter. Toronto, Ontario, October 2006. Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 14. Mrs. Alec Davis makes a call. John Meredith walked slowly home. At first he thought a little about Rosemary, but by the time he reached Rainbow Valley he had forgotten all about her, and was meditating on a point regarding German theology which Ellen had raised. He passed through Rainbow Valley and knew it not. The charm of Rainbow Valley had no potency against German theology. When he reached the manse he went to his study and took down a bulky volume in order to see which had been right, he or Ellen. He remained immersed in its mazes until dawn, struck a new trail of speculation, and pursued it like a sleuth-hound for the next week, utterly lost to his world, his parish, and his family. He read day and night. He forgot to go to his meals when Una was not there to drag him to them. He never thought about Rosemary or Ellen again. Old Mrs. Marshall over harbour was very ill and sent for him, but the message lay unheeded on his desk and gathered dust. Mrs. Marshall recovered, but never forgave him. A young couple came to the manse to be married, and Mr. Meredith, with unbrushed hair, in carpet slippers and faded dressing-gown, married them. To be sure, he began by reading the funeral service to them, and got along as far as ashes to ashes and dust to dust before he vaguely suspected that something was wrong. "Dear me," he said absently, "that is strange, very strange." The bride, who was very nervous, began to cry. The bridegroom, who was not in the least nervous, giggled. "Please, sir, I think you're burying us instead of marrying us," he said. "Excuse me," said Mr. Meredith, as if it did not matter much. He turned up the marriage service and got through with it, but the bride never felt quite properly married for the rest of her life. He forgot his prayer meeting again, but that did not matter, for it was a wet night and nobody came. He might even have forgotten his Sunday service if it had not been for Mrs. Alec Davis. Aunt Martha came in on Saturday afternoon and told him that Mrs. Davis was in the parlour and wanted to see him. Mr. Meredith sighed. Mrs. Davis was the only woman in Glen St. Mary Church whom he positively detested. Unfortunately, she was also the richest, and his board of managers had warned Mr. Meredith against offending her. Mr. Meredith seldom thought of such a worldly matter as his stipend, but the managers were more practical. Also, they were astute. Without mentioning money, they contrived to instill into Mr. Meredith's mind a conviction that he should not offend Mrs. Davis. Otherwise, he would likely have forgotten all about her as soon as Aunt Martha had gone out. As it was, he turned down his Ewald with a feeling of annoyance and went across the hall to the parlour. Mrs. Davis was sitting on the sofa, looking about her with an air of scornful disapproval. What a scandalous room! There were no curtains on the window. Mrs. Davis did not know that Faith and Una had taken them down the day before to use as court trains in one of their plays, and had forgotten to put them up again, but she could not have accused those windows more fiercely if she had known. The blinds were cracked and torn. The pictures on the walls were crooked. The rugs were awry. The vases were full of faded flowers. The dust lay in heaps, literally in heaps. "What are we coming to?" Mrs. Davis asked herself, and then primmed up her unbeautiful mouth. Jerry and Carl had been whooping and sliding down the banisters as she came through the hall. They did not see her, and continued whooping and sliding, and Mrs. Davis was convinced they did it on purpose. Faith's pet rooster ambled through the hall, stood in the parlour doorway, and looked at her. Not liking her looks, he did not venture in. Mrs. Davis gave a scornful sniff. A pretty manse indeed, where roosters paraded the halls and stared people out of countenance. "Shoo there!" commanded Mrs. Davis, poking her flounced, changeable silk parasol at him. Adam shooed. He was a wise rooster, and Mrs. Davis had wrung the necks of so many roosters with her own fair hands in the course of her 50 years, that an air of the executioner seemed to hang around her. Adam scuttled through the hall as the minister came in. Mr. Meredith still wore slippers and dressing-gown, and his dark hair still fell in uncared-for locks over his high brow. But he looked the gentleman he was, and Mrs. Alec Davis, in her silk dress and beplumed bonnet, and kid gloves and gold chain, looked the vulgar, coarse-souled woman she was. Each felt the antagonism of the other's personality. Mr. Meredith shrank, but Mrs. Davis girded up her loins for the fray. She had come to the manse to propose a certain thing to the minister, and she meant to lose no time in proposing it. She was going to do him a favour, a great favour, and the sooner he was made aware of it, the better. She had been thinking about it all summer, and had come to a decision at last. This was all that mattered, Mrs. Davis thought. When she decided a thing, it was decided. Nobody else had any say in the matter. That had always been her attitude. When she had made up her mind to marry Alec Davis, she had married him, and that was the end to it. Alec had never known how it happened, but what odds? So in this case, Mrs. Davis had arranged everything to her own satisfaction. Now it only remained to inform Mr. Meredith. "Will you please shut that door?" said Mrs. Davis, unprimming her mouth slightly to say it, but speaking with asperity. "I have something important to say, and I can't say it with that racket in the hall." Mr. Meredith shut the door meekly. Then he sat down before Mrs. Davis. He was not wholly aware of her yet. His mind was still wrestling with Ewald's arguments. Mrs. Davis sensed this detachment, and it annoyed her. "I have come to tell you, Mr. Meredith," she said aggressively, "that I have decided to adopt Una." "To adopt Una?" Mr. Meredith gazed at her blankly, not understanding her in the least. "Yes, I've been thinking it over for some time. I have often thought of adopting a child since my husband's death, but it seemed so hard to get a suitable one. It is very few children I would want to take into my home. I wouldn't think of taking a home child. some outcast of the slums in all probability, and there is hardly ever any other child to be got. One of the fishermen down at the harbour died last fall and left 6 youngsters. They tried to get me to take one, but I soon gave them to understand that I had no idea of adopting trash like that. Their grandfather stole a horse. Besides, they were all boys, and I wanted a girl, a quiet, obedient girl that I could train up to be a lady. Una will suit me exactly. She would be a nice little thing if she was properly looked after, so different from Faith. I would never dream of adopting Faith. But I'll take Una, and I'll give her a good home and upbringing, Mr. Meredith, and if she behaves herself, I'll leave her all my money when I die. Not one of my own relatives shall have a cent of it in any case. I'm determined on that. It was the idea of aggravating them that set me to thinking of adopting a child as much as anything in the first place. Una shall be well dressed and educated and trained, Mr. Meredith, and I shall give her music and painting lessons and treat her as if she was my own." Mr. Meredith was wide enough awake by this time. There was a faint flush in his pale cheek, and a dangerous light in his fine dark eyes. Was this woman, whose vulgarity and consciousness of money oozed out of her at every pore, actually asking him to give her Una? His dear little wistful Una, with Cecilia's own dark blue eyes, the child whom the dying mother had clasped to her heart after the other children had been led weeping from the room. Cecilia had clung to her baby until the gates of death had shut between them. She had looked over the little dark head to her husband. "Take good care of her, John," she had entreated. "She is so small and sensitive. The others can fight their way, but the world will hurt her. Oh, John, I don't know what you and she are going to do. You both need me so much. But keep her close to you. Keep her close to you." These had been almost her last words, except a few unforgettable ones for him alone. And it was this child whom Mrs. Davis had coolly announced her intention of taking from him. He sat up straight and looked at Mrs. Davis. In spite of the worn dressing-gown and the frayed slippers, there was something about him that made Mrs. Davis feel a little of the old reverence for the cloth in which she had been brought up. After all, there was a certain divinity hedging a minister, even a poor, unworldly, abstracted one. "I thank you for your kind intentions, Mrs. Davis," said Mr. Meredith, with a gentle, final, quite awful courtesy, "but I cannot give you my child." Mrs. Davis looked blank. She had never dreamed of his refusing. "Why, Mr. Meredith," she said in astonishment, "you must be you can't mean it. You must think it over. Think of all the advantages I can give her." "There is no need to think it over, Mrs. Davis. It is entirely out of the question. All the worldly advantages it is in your power to bestow on her could not compensate for the loss of a father's love and care. I thank you again, but it is not to be thought of." Disappointment angered Mrs. Davis beyond the power of old habit to control. Her broad red face turned purple, and her voice trembled. "I thought you'd be only too glad to let me have her," she sneered. "Why did you think that?" asked Mr. Meredith quietly. "Because nobody ever supposed you cared anything about your children," retorted Mrs. Davis contemptuously. "You neglect them scandalously. It is the talk of the place. They aren't fed and dressed properly, and they are not trained at all. They have no more manners than a pack of wild Indians. You never think of doing your duty as a father. You let a stray child come here among them for a fortnight, and never took any notice of her, a child that swore like a trooper, I'm told. You wouldn't have cared if they'd caught smallpox from her. And Faith made an exhibition of herself, getting up and preaching and making that speech. And she rid a pig down the street, under your very eyes, I understand. The way they act is past belief, and you never lift a finger to stop them, or try to teach them anything. And now when I offer one of them a good home and good prospects, You refuse it, and insult me. A pretty father you, to talk of loving and caring for your children." "That will do, woman," said Mr. Meredith. He stood up and looked at Mrs. Davis with eyes that made her quail. "That will do," he repeated. "I desire to hear no more, Mrs. Davis. You have said too much. It may be that I have been remiss in some respects in my duty as a parent, but it is not for you to remind me of it in such terms as you have used. Let us say good afternoon." Mrs. Davis did not say anything half so amiable as good afternoon, but she took her departure. As she swept past the minister, a large plump toad, which Carl had secreted under the lounge, hopped out almost under her feet. Mrs. Davis gave a shriek, and in trying to avoid treading on the awful thing, lost her balance and her parasol. She did not exactly fall, but she staggered and reeled across the room in a very undignified fashion, and brought up against the door with a thud that jarred her from head to foot. Mr. Meredith, who had not seen the toad, wondered if she had been attacked with some kind of apoplectic or paralytic seizure, and ran in alarm to her assistance. But Mrs. Davis, recovering her feet, waved him back furiously. "Don't you dare to touch me!" she almost shouted. "This is some more of your children's doings, I suppose. This is no fit place for a decent woman. Give me my umbrella and let me go. I'll never darken the doors of your manse or your church again." Mr. Meredith picked up the gorgeous parasol meekly enough and gave it to her. Mrs. Davis seized it and marched out. Jerry and Carl had given up banister sliding and were sitting on the edge of the veranda with Faith. Unfortunately, all three were singing at the tops of their healthy young voices, "There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight." Mrs. Davis believed the song was meant for her, and her only. She stopped and shook her parasol at them. "Your father is a fool," she said, "and you are 3 young varmints that ought to be whipped within an inch of your lives." "He isn't!" cried Faith. "We're not!" cried the boys. But Mrs. Davis was gone. "Goodness, isn't she mad!" said Jerry. "And what is a varmint, anyhow?" John Meredith paced up and down the parlor for a few minutes. Then he went back to his study and sat down. But he did not return to his German theology. He was too grievously disturbed for that. Mrs. Davis had wakened him up with a vengeance. Was he such a remiss, careless father as she had accused him of being? Had he so scandalously neglected the bodily and spiritual welfare of the 4 little motherless creatures dependent on him? Were his people talking of it as harshly as Mrs. Davis had declared? It must be so, since Mrs. Davis had come to ask for Una in the full and confident belief that he would hand the child over to her as unconcernedly and gladly as one might hand over a strayed, unwelcome kitten. And if so, what then? John Meredith groaned and resumed his pacing up and down the dusty, disordered room. What could he do? He loved his children as deeply as any father could, and he knew, past the power of Mrs. Davis or any of her ilk to disturb his conviction, that they loved him devotedly. But was he fit to have charge of them? He knew, none better, his weaknesses and limitations. What was needed was a good woman's presence and influence and common sense. But how could that be arranged? Even were he able to get such a housekeeper, it would cut Aunt Martha to the quick. She believed she could still do all that was meet and necessary. He could not so hurt and insult the poor old woman who had been so kind to him and his. How devoted she had been to Cecilia! And Cecilia had asked him to be very considerate of Aunt Martha. To be sure, he suddenly remembered that Aunt Martha had once hinted that he ought to marry again. He felt she would not resent a wife as she would a housekeeper. But that was out of the question. He did not wish to marry. He did not and could not care for anyone. Then what could he do? It suddenly occurred to him that he would go over to Ingleside and talk over his difficulties with Mrs. Blythe. Mrs. Blythe was one of the few women he never felt shy or tongue-tied with. She was always so sympathetic and refreshing. It might be that she could suggest some solution of his problems, and even if she could not, Mr. Meredith felt that he needed a little decent human companionship after his dose of Mrs. Davis, something to take the taste of her out of his soul. He dressed hurriedly and ate his supper less abstractedly than usual. It occurred to him that it was a poor meal. He looked at his children. They were rosy and healthy-looking enough, except Una, and she had never been very strong, even when her mother was alive. They were all laughing and talking. Certainly they seemed happy. Carl was especially happy because he had two most beautiful spiders crawling around his supper plate. Their voices were pleasant, their manners did not seem bad, they were considerate of and gentle to one another. Yet Mrs. Davis had said their behaviour was the talk of the congregation. As Mr. Meredith went through his gate, Dr. Blythe and Mrs. Blythe drove past on the road that led to Lowbridge. The minister's face fell. Mrs. Blythe was going away. There was no use in going to Ingleside. And he craved a little companionship more than ever. As he gazed rather hopelessly over the landscape, the sunset light struck on a window of the old West homestead on the hill. It flared out rosily like a beacon of good hope. He suddenly remembered Rosemary and Ellen West. He thought that he would relish some of Ellen's pungent conversation. He thought it would be pleasant to see Rosemary's slow, sweet smile and calm, heavenly blue eyes again. What did that old poem of Sir Philip Sidney say? Continual comfort in the face. That just suited her, and he needed comfort. Why not go and call? He remembered that Ellen had asked him to drop in sometimes, and there was Rosemary's book to take back. He ought to take it back before he forgot. He had an uneasy suspicion that there were a great many books in his library which he had borrowed at sundry times and in divers places, and had forgotten to take back. It was surely his duty to guard against that in this case. He went back into his study, got the book, and plunged downward into Rainbow Valley. End of chapter 14.